Well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Gary Goodman. I'm the author of The Last Bookseller. And I'd like to thank Brent and Emily for having me talk here tonight to talk about my book, The Last Bookseller. The title, The Last Bookseller, has kind of caused me a lot of problems. Because as you might imagine, I still have friends who are booksellers who are still in the book business. And they say, well, what's this about The Last Bookseller? I'm still selling books. So I do talk in the book about how I'm one of the last, a certain kind of bookseller. When I was selling books, there was no internet. There was no. You had to travel to buy books. You had to know what people were interested in. That kind of thing, without a computer at your fingertips. So, as I say in the book, when the internet came along, it was for secondhand booksellers, like a lawyer waking up and discovering that all his clients had gotten law degrees. Before 2000, it took years of experience to become a successful secondhand bookseller. After 2000, anyone in their pajamas with a box of books, a cup of coffee, and a cable connection could buy and sell books. Between 1990 and 2000, there were nearly 400 used and rare bookshops in New York City, and now there are fewer than 70. Yeah, there were almost 50 in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and now there are fewer than 10. So the internet wiped out many secondhand booksellers and their traditional bookshops almost over. It's been estimated that over 70% of all the secondhand bookstores around before 2000 have either gone online or gone business. So the internet has had a significant impact. This particular business, and also all sorts of other businesses too. Yellow pages, travel agencies. So it's a sign of the rapid advance of technology, and these are the kinds of changes that you see, and this book is sort of an account of that. The book itself is about my nearly 40-year career as a used and rare book dealer. And in Minnesota, in some ways, a conventional started as a bookseller in 1982. Some of the unusual people I met, including some of the more notorious criminals. I know Emily is really interested in that. And the people I met buying and selling books and the unusual book sites and the weird places. Since the book is subtitled A Life in the Rare Book Trade, let's talk a minute about how I got into the used book business in the first place. It was 1982, and I was working as a psychiatric counselor on a unit that treated violent, mentally ill adolescents. We talk about a particularly scary incident in the book, but let's suffice it to say that I came to the realization that working with people that only kill you was not a viable long-term profession. And so I definitely was looking for something else to do. One day my wife, Mary Pat, who's in the audience, came home and told me that a small bookstore, used bookstore about a few blocks away from us, East St. Paul, was going out of business and that I should go check it out. Mind you, before I went into the store, I had never been in a used bookstore. So it was a new experience. When I went to the store, as I say in the book, it was no bigger than a rich person's walk-in. It was very, very small. filled with books, Reader's Digest, condensed books, paperbacks, book club books, all really ratty looking, although they didn't realize it at the time. And there were a lot of older books that were published in the 1800s. And I thought, geez, these have to be valuable because they're so old. And I, of course, didn't know at the time that just because a book is old doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. I struck up a conversation with the owner, whose name was Frank, and he claimed he was closing the store because he had heart condition. It wasn't because the store was in East St. Paul, which, if you know what East St. Paul, it's probably the most unlikely place for a bookstore you can imagine. But he was closing the store because he had a heart condition. He said he wanted to sell the store, but he couldn't find anyone interested in buying. So I described in the book, I described what next. So the thought of buying a going concern filled with valuable books. I like books that, from a man who, but for a heart condition, would not be selling his plum in East St. Paul, made perfect sense. If you sold the business instead of closing it, how much would it be? I asked Frank, just out of curiosity. Frank's eyes lit up his prospect. Let's see, he said, climbing up on the chair behind him, grabbing a pencil. You have your books, 4,000 good books, handpicked. Then your fixtures, the bookcases, display racks, etc. Then there's the goodwill, the name, the location. These all add value to the business. I'd probably sell the whole thing for $25,000. $25,000. I could barely pay my rent, actually. I already worked double shifts on the psychiatric unit 2 or 3 times a week. The car I drove, a 1967 or a 1969 Volvo, I bought for $200. Didn't have working windshield wipers. On cold nights, I had to bring the battery also. Start in the morning. Frank saw the shock the figure generated. Of course, he continued, I have the heart condition, plus I'd have to move all the books that don't sell. So I'd probably take 10,000. I turned away, but Frank continued to negotiate with himself. Then there's the lease on the store, he said, which runs another 3 months. I'll be on the hook for that, so I'm thinking I'd hate to do it, but I'd take 2,000 for the whole thing. He paused, no reaction. On a contract for deed of $100 a month, I perked up. Nothing down here, and that's how I became the owner of the used bookstore. Well, even at this bargain basement price, this turned out to be a horrible decision. I found out later that Frank's 4,000 books were the leftovers he picked up from every estate sale, library sale, book sale in town, books he rescued on the way to dumpster. I had another book dealer come over and look at the books. He said they were the worst, most picked over books he'd ever seen in his life. Still, like so many before me, I became fascinated by the second-hand book business. During my first years on Arcade Street, I muddled through working the night shift and running the store during the day. One thing I did do was start going to estate library sales. There, as I say in the book, I met the denizens of the book buying underworld. From the book again, some of the most educated, honorable people I ever met were in the book business, but some of the most unsavory and illiterate were book people too. Those who operated at the low level of someone met as they moved up the ranks could be strange and troubled individuals. Loners, survivalists, petty criminals, regularly black sold used books on the open market. I was new, unfamiliar with their rituals, a curiosity to the other book. Are you the idiot who bought Frank's store in St. Paul? I eventually figured the book business out, started a book search service, and moved to Stillwater in 1990, where with a couple of partners, I started St. Croix Antiquarian Stillwater Books. The bookstores were so successful and caused so many other book dealers to move to town that Richard Booth, the founder of the first book town in Wales and the self-proclaimed King of AMY, came over from the UK in 1994 and declared Stillwater the first book town in North America. The book town movement. The Booktown movement, as Richard Booth called it, began in the late 60s when Richard began buying up books that libraries in the UK were discarding, and he would put these in abandoned buildings in the downtown of his hometown of Hay, and this attracted book buyers and the booksellers to the town, and it became known as the Town of Books. Booth was pretty eccentric, and I say that, and that's kind of yeah, he was crazy, but he had a genius for publicity. From the book, I say, after a run-in with the Wales Tourist Board in 1977. Booth declared Hay an independent nation and appointed himself king. This generated enormous publicity. 6 television stations came to Hay to listen to him explain why the town was no longer part of the United Kingdom. The Hay Air Force at biplane made a fly past. A rowing boat was launched as the Hay Navy, and the sovereign retired to the pub to name his government. It was April Fool's Day, and the king was wearing a crown made out of tin. The orb and scepter were made from coins. King Richard issued passports and printed money for the kingdom of Hay. He appointed a Hay House of Lords and installed his horse as in the book, I also talk about traveling to another book town in Archer City, Texas, which was started by the author Larry McMurtry. His books, Lonesome Dove, this picture show. And he bought up a bunch of abandoned buildings in downtown Archer City and filled them with books, and then declared that Archer City was a book town. You can read about my travels to these 2 book towns in the book, but I think the point here is that they show how popular used and rare books were in the mid-1990s. These book towns generally it's hard to overstate how much more interest there was in the used and rare book business at the turn of the last century than there is now. The internet kind of standardized the business, made books more accessible, but it also drove down prices and drove traditional bookshops out of business. Before the internet, it was like the Wild West, with booksellers making dramatic purchases and more colorful characters like Richard Booth. There were also, as I described in the book, some colorful criminals. In the 80s and 90s were marked by an unusual level of thievery and treachery, as you might expect in a business that's largely unregulated and where there are valuable items that people can either steal or take take it legally. Plus libraries and institutions didn't have very good security systems, and so a lot of these criminals took advantage of that. I talk about the direct and sometimes glancing contact I had with some of the more notorious criminals of this area, of this era. The one that's most interesting to people in Minnesota is Stephen Bloomberg, who was from St. Paul. And he lived in St. Paul and was known as the Book Bandit. He was arrested in 1990 for stealing 23,600 books worth an estimated $20 million. And then in the book, I talk about him coming into the arcade streets. Stephen Bloomberg first came into the Arcade Street store in 1989, wearing an overcoat and black woolen gloves with the fingers cut, like a character from Dickens. He was seated with greasy hair and big mustache. According to the wife of one of Bloomberg's friends, he was so unkempt that she felt she had to Lysol the chair he sat in whenever he stopped. He made an impression on me because he had these big googly eyes. He came in a few times, mostly on weekends, and would stand inside the front door looking at me with his buggy eyes. If I talked to him and asked if I could talk, he'd leave. Finally, he asked if I had a rare book with me. As I recall, he said that not only did I not have a rare book with me, I didn't think I had any rare books. With that, he left and never came back. When I found out later who he was, I was mildly insulted that he didn't even bother looking around to see if I had any books worth stealing. Unlike most book thieves, Bloomberg didn't steal books to sell, but to protect them. He was pretty crazy. He didn't steal books to sell, but to protect them from the owners. So not selling the books allowed him to kind of continue his crime spree for so many years. His base of operations was a rundown 17-room house in Ohio, where he stored in perfect order his stolen collection. He was arrested in 1990, and a psychiatrist who testified at his trial had said that he was an obsessive compulsive, kind of couldn't help himself. But he was, and to illustrate that, he went to prison for 5 years and got out and just kept stealing books. He was a pretty hard case. One of the other people I had some contact with was John Jenkins, who was a Texas book. He was probably the most, he was president of the American, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, which is about as high up in the book business as you can get. So when I talk about him, my contact with John Jenkins came when he ordered some unusual Texas books that I listed in one of my weekly catalogs. He ordered several and promised to send a check for them the following day. I'd heard of Jenkins, who was from Austin, Texas, because he was the president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association from 1980 to 1982, and was widely regarded as one of the premier book dealers. For a lowly bookseller like me, this is like getting a call from King. Jenkins wrote a book, and he described selling over 500,000 items worth $30 million to the University of Texas and other institutions. But Jenkins was as notorious for drinking, gambling, and womanizing as he was for buying and selling books. Emily knows this. He played high stakes. He played high stakes poker in Las Vegas in the early 1980s. And was known on the circuit as Austin's Squatty for his unusual habit of sitting at the table, perched on a chair with his legs beneath him. He was barely 6'6" or 5'6", and to compensate for his short stature, he wore cowboy boots made out of ostrich and snake skins with 3-inch heels. He wore a Stetson cowboy hat, smoked big cigars, and sometimes came to the poker tables wearing a big coat. He was actually a pretty good poker player. Between 1983 and 1987, he won $155,000 in a variety of tournaments in Las Vegas, and made 3 final tables at the World Series of Poker. But he was gambling, he golfed, and he was a terrible golfer. He lost thousands of dollars golfing, and he was constantly in need of money. So he, luckily for him, is the warehouse where he kept his rare books and things kept burning up. And so I say that the warehouse where he kept his rare books, for instance, kept burning down on 2 occasions. He collected millions of dollars in damages. Huh. After the warehouse caught fire the 3rd time, his insurance company suspected arson and wouldn't pay. Jenkins wasn't charged, but the ABA got fed up with all the bad publicity and kicked him out of the organization in 1988. And the walls then started closing in on the job in 1989, when it was discovered by the University of Texas that a lot of the paper materials that he had sold them for so much money, become rich, copy of the Texas Constitution, were forgeries. And so so I say in the book, things went from bad to worse for Jenkins when the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation sued him for fraud in 1989 in connection with a $1.3 million loan that he'd taken to finance a wildcat drilling operation. Then things got way worse. On April 16th, 1989, Jenkins was found dead floating in a stretch of the Colorado River between Austin and Bastrop, Texas. All the evidence pointed to murder. He had been shot in the back of the head. The passenger side door of his gold Mercedes was found ajar, and all his cash and credit cards were missing from his wallet. Still, Con Kiersey, the sheriff of Bastrop County, ruled the death suicide. To explain why a gun was never, this is a famous case. To explain why a gun was never found at the scene of the crime, Kiersey created what came to be known as the plastic coat theory. He believed Jenkins attached the gun he used to a large plastic boat riddled with holes. After shooting himself, Jenkins dropped the bottle into the river and floated downstream until it filled with water and sank. Perhaps by staging his suicide as a murder, Jenkins wanted to defraud his insurance company one last time. But there were plenty of people who did. So that was those are a couple of the colorful characters I had some contact with, and they weren't the only one. I had some contact with Mark Hoffman, the Worn and Rare book dealer who murdered 2 people to cover up his extensive forgeries. And there's just recently Netflix did a documentary on Mark Hoffman, and it's pretty interesting. Yeah, it's quite good. He made bombs, but he was pretty bad at it. He wound up blowing. He kind of blew himself up to survive. And then I also knew I had some contact with E. Forbes Smiley III, who was a respected map dealer who cut maps with millions of dollars of rare library books. So through the story of my bookselling career, the Last Bookseller tries to put what happened to the second-hand book business in some context. The transition from traveling booksellers and personalized bookshops to the largely impersonal internet has probably been the most significant change to second-hand bookselling since the invention of the press. More important than the ups and downs of the book business, however, is the fundamental change that I think everyone sees, that people's attitude towards books has really changed because of technology. Because before, where you would have to look things up in a book, information book, a lot of that is going to the internet. I don't think there's quite the reverence for books that there was maybe before that. After, as I say in the book, so the kind of bookseller, going back to the Last Bookseller. So the kind of bookseller I'm talking about here is an ancient breed. Before the last dog dies, I wanted to describe what it was like to make a living in this curious and business. I traveled enough throughout the US, the United Kingdom, and Canada, and saw enough to know my experience reflect the changes that occurred in bookselling at the end of the 20th century. These stories are told from my perspective, but are meant to give a realistic picture of this age-old occupation. The booksellers I described here might not be the last of us, but they are likely the last. And with that, I'll take some.
Could you repeat the last sentence? I missed the last few words.
Oh, okay. I say the booksellers I described here may not be the last of us, but they are likely the last. Sure.
Where did you find your best quality books? Did you find them in other bookstores or antique stores, or
Usually from I talk in the book about these quotas. Like when I was before the internet again, in order for someone to find a book, they had to come to a second book dealer. I mean, it was a monopoly. If you wanted a book that was out of print, you had to go to a second book dealer. And the way that you would find a book was you would advertise in a publication called the AB Bookman's Weekly. It came out every week, and it was like I say, as thick as a small phone book. And in there, every it was just full of books wanted by dealers. So I mean, that's how inefficient it is. So you'd have to send in. Let's say you wanted a hit on the history of the St. Croix. Yeah, you would come to me and say, Gary, I need this book. You pay me a couple of bucks. And I'd send an ad in to the AB Bookman's Weekly. 2 weeks later, it would come out in an issue, and then some other book dealer would have to see it. And then they would send me a postcard, telling me that they had the book, and this is how much, this is the condition, and this is how much they wanted for it. And that could be a month and a half, maybe 2 months. And that was on condition that somebody actually saw it. Somebody actually took the time to send me a postcard. But to get back to your question, the people who sent these postcards, these photos, were people who worked out of their houses, and they would spend, hours a day or days a week looking through this A.B. Bookman's Weekly, would be filling out these postcards. But they're the people that had all the good books. They're the ones. And so when I would travel around, what I would do is I would make a point of finding these people. And they lived in the most godforsaken. You can imagine potholes. Their book would be in bar. And I talked about that book. It's playing the whole thing. But I would seek them out, and invariably they would be. They would. Number one, nobody was going in and buying the books that they had, and number two, they really made an effort to go out and look for them, find them, and they were so thrilled that somebody would actually come to their house that the books were cheap, so that's kind of what I did. And I think that I was one of the few people, but it was pretty precarious.
Did you ever run into a situation where you got a postcard and it would say, "Oh, the book is in great condition," and then you received it and it was in poor condition?
Yeah.
Did that happen?
Yeah, and then you just send.
Okay.
Or it depends. A lot of these guys would be like a $2 book. It wouldn't be worth your time to even send it. It was. There were the secondhand bookstores, and then there were book scouts but these were in the kind of in the larger cities. But then in the rural areas, places out of the way places, there were still these people who were book crazy, but they had no venue for their books, so they would do this quoting. And sometimes it was, if you, like I say in the book, if you advertised for a common book, you could get 100, 150 postcards, and they'd sell you the book for $1. So how many? But they did it because they liked books, and that was kind of the hobby, and they were doing it. It was really. But in terms of efficiency, it was just so inefficient. So, and now you can find almost virtually anything you want. That's a big difference. Yeah.
A truly rare book that is musty, how much does that affect the value? You open it up and you think,
It depends on what is there any damage like mold?
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of something that, you don't want to be getting close to.
Just odor or actually stain?
No, I'm talking about not stain, the smell, the musty smell that makes you wonder if it might be mold, but you don't see anything.
You don't see anything.
Yeah.
Well, one thing you can do to try and get rid of it is to take the book like this, fan it up like this, and take a fan and just run that fan, right? And that fan will cause the pages to separate. And so you're getting air, and you can try that. And some people actually use like a mild spray. And something that's, but not much, but simply to get like a Lysol spray. And they'll spray it right into that thing. And it'll go right into the book and then it gets. And then I've heard of other people doing the same thing, but they'll put it in the microwave. And that'll kill the mold or spore.
We have a, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I never met this guy, but there used to be stories about a bookseller in Minneapolis. And he moved into an old firehouse on the West Bank.
Oh,
I
sure.
think his name was Macabre.
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 I got a whole, almost, well, it's not a whole chapter, but it's several pages about.
Okay.
And he went into his store started in, he started selling books in 1952 on the porch of a house right near in Dinky. And he eventually moved into the firehouse, and then the developers came. And so they bought him out. They gave him enough money so that he could buy a mansion. Well, it wasn't actually a mansion. It was old folks. It was a big brick building on Lake Minnetonka. And he had a half a million books. And that's, I mean, I could read it, but he had a 500,000 books in his house, and I had pictures of it, and also talk about going out there. Yeah, he was another character, and the thing is that now that everything is online, all the transactions are through the internet. You don't see a lot of these real personal characters. But yeah, it's this story's all.
We have a question from the chat, 2 questions from NLG, or sorry, NJG. What was your favorite part of the day-to-day business? And what gave you the most joy as a book dealer?
Well, it was, I would say that finding books was probably the most interesting, it was probably the most interesting part of it. And, I would travel with my buddy I talked about, Paul Kissenberg, and that was always it. But it's not I had 6 kids, and I had to support, and so, there was a certain amount of joy in it, but it also, to me, it was a business. And I couldn't, I traveled probably a week to 10 days, and for maybe 10 years, looking for books. So, it was not, I wasn't sitting around smoking a cigar and shooing away the cats. But I'm grateful I got it. I learned a lot more than travel. And I wrote a book.
I have another question.
Sure.
When you started out and you ended up with this shop full of books that were pretty worthless, and you're a complete novice to the business, how did you progress from there? What was the steepest part of the learning curve when getting the business going and viable?
Well, it was, first of all, like I say in the talk, I said I had a bookseller. So these are the first books you've ever seen. And so I realized I had, and it was in a small space, and I had 4,000 bad books. And so I realized I had to get rid of them. So every week I would bring boxes of books to Goodwill, just to get rid of them. And then the thing that was kind of sustained me was this AV Book Weekly, because at that point I was a quote. I was one of the people that was looking through that AV Book Weekly, trying to find books that I could sell to other book dealers, and so I'd be sending postcards and that kind of thing, and made very, didn't make very good sales at all. But fortunately, I still was working. I was still working at the hospital, so I could support my family after the fashion, as I say. So I didn't need, at that point, I didn't need to, the bookstore was my sole means of support. But studying the AV Bookman's Weekly and learning what people were looking, what books were the most popular, and it, honestly, it took me probably 4 years to really learn, to really get a sense of that, to really get a sense of what people were looking for. And then the next turning point was I started a book search service. So I started to, and what I would do is I would mail letters to new bookstores, and I'd say, if some of your customers are looking for a book that's out of print or a used book, just give them this postcard, and they would give them one of my postcards, and that was a very significant turning point, because amazingly enough, a lot of these new bookstores would take those cards and give them to their customers, because they just wanted to get them off their back. And they'd give them to their customers, and they'd send them to me, and I'd put in ads in the AV Bookman's Weekly. But I guarantee you that 1 out of 1,000 people that were in the situation that I was in, and this is not to say, but I think would have failed. I just happened to be too stubborn to quit, and was lucky enough to come up with a couple of decent ideas and some work, and so I was able to survive. But I really, if I had to do it over again, I really questioned the same.
What was your most memorable find for somebody, or when you're out, all of a sudden if you think back of all the things that you discovered, what's the one?
Well, one was an essay concerning human understanding. It was by, who's that? Must have been that. But that was a 1690 book, and I was able to buy that for maybe $100. At the time, that was very significant for my wife and children to survive. But there have been a lot. I found books by, signed by Walt Disney, John F. Chagall art books. There's been just a lot of books, but unlike a lot of booksellers, who say, "Well, let's put that away for a while," I never. The next day, I was out flogging, trying to make money.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, was there one book that you're still looking for that you haven't found yet that you're hoping to, or something someone requested?
I don't think I'm not into. I'm working on another book, and that's the book I'm probably not looking for I have a son he does fine binding. And so it's always interesting to see what he comes up with. He was just at the Boston Book Fair. Some interesting. As far as I'm concerned.
You've checked them all off.
Yeah.
What about your collection of fine binding?
Well, that's Jonathan. Yeah, I have a collection of, there's a certain convention of people who bind books in leather. And the binders sign the books, and it's really not a signature, it's like a printed embossed kind of thing, sign the book. As you know, on the edge of the book. But I have collected for nearly 40 years these signed that so I have I have like a first edition The Call of the Wild, that's one the first edition. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. These are all really good books, but they're limited by the space on book. So over the years, as I collected them, I would put it, if I found a better book than the because I have seen booksellers go down dark road as far as collecting books, and they wind up with a house of some good books and local books, but so I resolved not to go beyond. I think it's like 3 books. There's some, and I'm going to give those. Like,
The gentleman asked about the book. I worked for Gary for 20 years. And
best
he
20
doesn't
years of your
remember
life.
this, a lot of this stuff. But we had a copy there. There were 4 copies in the world that belonged to the Pope.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He doesn't remember those. And it was about yay big, and it was, I think, around 1500 or maybe
1502.
Yeah. So
And I read about that.
okay.
Yeah, I did the Missali, Leonidas. Yeah, and there were 4 known copies of this book, and it was, the printing press was invented in 1440, and this book was printed in 1502. Monsters book like that, and there were, a beautiful, beautiful book. But when I bought it, the person that was selling it, there was no date on there's no title page. It just started out with the printing. Well, it turns out that people didn't use title pages until maybe 1504. So all the printing information was in the back of the book. So, yeah, that was
One day, Gary's got this book. This thing was about this big too, but it was in really nice condition. And that turned out to be a copy of Mein Kampf.
oh,
That was a limited edition given to, I think, the SS.
25 copies.
Yeah.
And Hitler gave it to his general. So it was, and the problem with that one, what's the problem in it?
I mean, you just mentioned Hitler. I'm not going to grin.
No, the problem with my copy was that most of the copies had the front page of who Hitler gave the copy to, so it could have been Gary, whoever it was. The page in mine was taken, so it wasn't nearly as valuable. Because some of those copies had sold for 20,000. But this was in bound and vellum. Wow. And then, another valuable book that I would turn up every so often is Alcoholics. And the first edition of that is, I mean, it's probably worth $60,000. First edition of the Alchemy.
What was it, your publication? First edition?
I think it was like 1932, around there. And the problem with that book, when I say 60,000, I mean with the dust jacket. And the problem with that book was that the dust jacket was so bright, it was bright yellow, and the writing on it was so bold, Alcoholics Anonymous, that everybody threw the book. Because you know how anonymous is that? So it's very rare. But we had one in the store. I don't know if we had a second edition without a dust jacket. And I think we sold it.
People constantly came in looking for that book.
Oh, yeah,
It was constant.
that was hot stuff.
Yeah, how do you pick your window displays for the retail side of the business?
Maybe seasonal sometimes, or you know, a comp or whatever was new stuff. New stuff would come. No rhyme or reason.
I loved that Bavar elephant
Yeah,
in your window. That's been there for decades, hasn't it?
which one?
It's a poster, I think it's framed with Bavar the elephant.
Well, that's not my.
That's not your store.
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no, that's not my.
Is that
I
black?
had that. No, I always had a gnomes book. And
Yeah.
That was.
Yeah.
So what about children's books and, you know, really fine old? traditions
Well,
of
yeah,
children's
there's
books?
my son is an expert. He used to, when he first started working for me when he was 12, he would go look for little golden, and they were particular kinds. They had to be early with, and then if he could find one with a dust jacket, something like that, and he sold those for hundreds of dollars. So unusual, like if there's a Nurse Nancy and it had the original Band-Aids.
No,
But some children's books are really.
as an adult getting older, I feel very nostalgic when I see some of those books.
Yeah,
And
if you go to a book fair, for example, those books, they have earlier children.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Gary.